Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to start off today's show by discussing a report by the RAND Corporation, which has found that Israeli Jews, Israeli Arabs, West Bank Palestinians, and Gazan Palestinians, they've separated Palestinians into two groups there, were more likely, to be uncertain about any of the solutions to the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And those are 5 solutions that at least RAND Corporation has spoken of, i.e. 2 states, a confederation, 1 state, Israeli annexation of Area C, or the status quo, just to continue that. Now, within this report, of course, there are a lot of details, which I'm sure we'll go into with our guests who are joining us to discuss that a bit further. But it also seems that the strategy that the Middle East peace plan had come up with, i.e. the Kushner plan in some ways, of economic peace, quote unquote, won't actually work because it's not actually about money as a priority for either side. And in this case, of course, with the Middle East peace plan, that seemed to be what was meant to entice at least the Palestinians into accepting that deal, seemingly. But that is not something that the Palestinians have played ball with either. Let's discuss all of these issues a bit further. We're now joined by Abbey, who is a research fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute. He's joining us today from Jerusalem. Also joining us today from Jerusalem is Jeff Halper, who is the director of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. And joining us from London is Dr. Melanie Garson, who is a lecturer in the Department of Political Science at University College London. Melanie, Alan, and Jeff, thank you to all 3 of you for your time today. Melanie, let me start with you, if I may. This RAND Corporation report, at least to me, and as an outsider to this issue, makes for a very depressing reading, doesn't it? Where it seems that everybody on both sides is just very sort of fed up with the situation. Is that your opinion on this as well?
I agree. I think it's interesting reading and not surprising reading, and a really well-founded report to be looked at. I think what it points to is what we call in fields sort of a question of an ethos of conflict. You've got people who have lived in conflict where their identity becomes defined to an extent by their relationship within the conflict, and it becomes a comfortable part of their identity, although it's uncomfortable, and the thought of shaking it up becomes very, very destabilizing. Now, whilst the Kushner plan and the sort of economic approach in this report would suggest be rejected, the one thing it has to be acknowledged is the attempt to bring a different solution to the table. But right now, what we're seeing is people, and one of the things the report did highlight is this dramatic mistrust between the people, between both Israelis and Palestinians, because both feel a sense of betrayal, and there are no bright, vibrant, creative voices on either side right now really advocating a way forward.
All right, so Jeff, you and I have many times and many shows discussed solutions to this issue, right? And 1 state has come up in that discussion a number of times. It seems that even that is something that both sides are uncertain about, even the Palestinians included, of course. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you know, there used to be an American senator, William Proxmire, who had an award he gave every year called the Golden Fleece Award, about how researchers fleece the American taxpayer by doing absolutely ridiculous, stupid kinds of research. And that's really what this should get the Golden Fleece Award of 2021. You know, the answer is duh. I mean, you know, first of all, it creates a false symmetry between Israelis and Palestinians. This whole both sides thing, as if they're equally invested. There aren't. The Israelis don't care. The whole issue of a conflict, of occupation, of Palestinians, that's all it's a non-starter. It's a non-issue in Israel. There's no uncertainty. Israel's enjoying life as it is. Everything is great. What's wrong with this picture? There's no uncertainty. They're not even thinking about a solution. In terms of the Palestinians, it's ridiculous. There's no uncertainty. The Palestinians are in a situation where they'll go with it with whatever works. Give us 2 states, we'll take it. Give us 1 state, we'll take it. Give us anything that we survive. They're almost saying we'll even take what we have now if you just give us some economic space to survive. So the whole idea that somehow there's an uncertainty that they're considering it. It's ridiculous. The Palestinians are the victims that have nowhere else to go, and the Israelis don't care. And so this is absolutely an absolutely ridiculous study that doesn't tell us anything.
I wanted to pick up on the point that Jeff made there about Israelis specifically and their view of the situation, because within the RAND report itself, it does actually talk about young Israelis more specifically and their view of this entire conflict, if I may call it that, or issue altogether. And they're not too worried about it, as in that doesn't even come up in their radar as a priority necessarily. In and of itself, isn't that worrying also, where, they're desensitized, if that's the right word, to the situation, and they don't even necessarily, as Jeff, to paraphrase Jeff, they don't care about it? I mean, is that fair to say?
But I also wanted to say first that it's not surprising that there is a great deal of mistrust on both sides. The lack of real contact between the two, despite power imbalances, which I acknowledge and which I think most thoughtful Israelis do acknowledge, is a problem. And however, the lack of contact that Palestinians have with real Israelis, average Israelis who aren't soldiers holding guns on them, and the same thing for Israelis who only get to see Palestinians when they're being arrested on the news. So that lack of contact is what leads to the lack of trust. As for a lack of caring, I'm sorry, I don't buy that. I do believe that Israelis care. There are so many issues, however, on the table right now that it's difficult to prioritize this. Because in the last year, certainly, and I know this survey was conducted before Corona, but even in the last years before that, the government paralysis, the decline in civil liberties, and the economic tightening of the country has brought other issues to fore as a result of the tighter security arrangements. And finally, I think that the security on both sides is, in fact, a crucial element. If both sides can be convinced that they will have security and freedom from fear, then I think there will be progress. But that freedom from fear won't come without trust. Okay,
so Melanie, how does one increase trust? I mean, in this situation where we have this impasse, and we've had this impasse for a very long time now, if we're completely honest. It's not like the situation is new. How does one build trust? You have Netanyahu in office right now. He doesn't seem to really be under a significant amount of pressure to really begin negotiations, to do anything in regards towards taking a step towards the Palestinians necessarily, because that would be, I would think, politically, suicidal for himself. But then on the other side, we also have the Palestinians who are set to go into elections and are also in many ways divided.
You're right. The conditions we always talk about when peace building and sort of these kind of processes need to be put in place, the conditions externally are not helpful, and adding into that COVID certainly adds another level to it, because the traditional methods of increasing trust, as has been pointed out, is contact, is really bringing people to explore the issues. And one of the things that emerged out of this report was what people who work in reconciliation and contact know for a long time, that they talked about actually the process of being in the focus groups and discussing it was hugely helpful for the understanding of the issues as a whole. So there has traditionally always been, even at the toughest time, a myriad of people working on different contact groups, on different reconciliation groups at the grassroots level, trickling that up to the political level when there is an obstacle or to listening to the voices of those groups is incredibly challenging, even without COVID. To be able to form those groups right now is difficult. I think there is, if the Palestinian, this is the other side of it, if the Palestinian leadership, and it's going to see what happens with the elections, can have a more coherent voice with the new view that's coming from external players for the Middle East, to have some really sort of out of the eye. I mean, the way that these narratives really shift at the political level is usually out of the eye conversation, similar to the Montfleur process that was done with South Africa, bringing together middle-level leaders, people with political clout, the high-level leaders, for some real good creative thinking. But the willingness has got to be there. And right now, the external circumstances don't lend itself to it. So we're reliant on the grassroots processes that try their best, but it's not easy.
All right, so because we've brought up, Jeff, our guests have brought up a number of times the pandemic and the context of the pandemic as well, I wanted to in fact address that. So I mean, in your point of view then, Jeff, what has the pandemic and the way Israel has dealt with the pandemic and the Palestinians have dealt with the pandemic, what has that shown? Because, there was a lot of criticism from around the world about the Israelis not in fact, ensuring that the Palestinians were also going to be vaccinated at the same level that the Israelis were also vaccinated, because, logically, it seems that if the Palestinians, if the virus is still circulating amongst the Palestinians, that is also just completely on a selfish reason an immediate threat to Israelis as well. But beyond that, what are your thoughts on that?
Israelis don't care. It's not even an issue. Giving vaccines to Palestinians is an international issue, but not in Israel. We don't even talk about it. What I do want to say is that, this whole thing about conflict resolution and dialogue and reconciliation and getting to know each other and not knowing each other, all that is nonsense. For years during the Oslo process, the EU, the UN, church groups, all kinds of NGOs put millions and millions of dollars into dialogue groups. And they came to the conclusion that they were absolutely worthless because they missed the whole point. And this is what I keep saying in every one of your programs. There is no two sides. This is not a conflict. There's no symmetry. Conflict resolution does not work. This is a situation of settler colonialism. Israel's intent from the very beginning of Zionism 100 years ago was to take over Palestine, to Judaize the country, to make Palestine into the land of Israel. That's the agenda. And if you try to avoid that all the time by thinking there's good faith or they want to talk to each other or Israelis just don't know Palestinians, and if they really got to know them, they'd like them and they talk, that's ridiculous. The whole idea, and the Israelis have been very upfront about it. Netanyahu's upfront about it. This is our country. It's the land of Israel. And the Palestinians have three choices. They can submit, or they can get out, or they can die. That's it. There's no dialogue. There's no conflict resolution. There's no negotiations. There's no good faith in this. And until people bite that bullet and understand what this situation really is, that it is not a conflict and that we have to decolonize, until then, all these reports and all this discussion is really, I'm sorry, it's nonsense. It gets us, it not only does it get us nowhere, but it takes us back because it's a form of conflict management that is bad for the Palestinians.
All right, so Alan, just looking at the overall establishment, the Israeli establishment I'm speaking about here specifically, do you think that the status quo does in fact benefit the Israeli establishment in the sense that the overarching goal, yes, if it is to have control over the entire land at some point in the near future, long-term future, medium future, this sort of suits them, right? Because settlement building is continuing, that sort of stuff is continuing, but the Palestinians yet aren't going anywhere, and I would think that that is an obstacle, though, still.
Well, first of all, I would have to disagree with Jeff Halper that the goal of Zionism from the beginning was to take over the entire land of Israel. There have been compromises made along the way. Yes, there have always been maximalists within the Israeli public sphere, but they have rarely won the day. And even settlers are really a minority, and while they sometimes drive the conversation, they do not drive the country. In fact, I would also say that despite announcements of continued settlement building, the settlement program is a failure in the sense that the average Israeli is not picked up and moved to the hills of Judea and Samaria, however historic they may be to the Jewish people. So it isn't imbalance in terms of power, yes, and it is. There are maximalists within the Israeli public sphere, but to claim that from the beginning Zionism has been a maximalist goal that wants to either wipe out or push out everybody in the country who isn't Jewish is just a overly simplified reading. Even if you go back into historic and biblical texts, the Jewish people were never the sole residents of the Holy Land. And from the state establishment in 48 on, there has been an awareness and an acceptance, however grudgingly, frankly, of the fact that the country is a democracy and that minorities within the country need to be protected. And that has to play itself out on the edges of the country as well.
Our clock has gotten the best of us, unfortunately, but I think this has been a good conversation overall. We appreciate Alan, Melanie, and Jeff for their time and for, of course, their insight. As Jeff there said, this is a situation which maybe in these sorts of reports it is unfair to, in fact, see this as a completely equal situation, right? This is, according to the international community, not my words, an occupation still, right? According to international understanding of the situation in Israel, Palestine. And so to see these two peoples as completely equal in the situation is unfair, and our guests have viewed it that way as well, Alan included. But yes, we are going to disagree upon what then this means. What does this report mean? Because to me, it just reads as very pessimistic. But as all of our guests also mentioned, it's not surprising. I mean, we all know this sort of stuff as well. We know that on both sides there is skepticism and just pessimism overall about how things will move going forward, especially on the Palestinian side, who has been under occupation for this long and does not see any light at the end of the tunnel at all. Will political unification on the Palestinian side strengthen the Palestinian hand? That is the hope, at least on the Palestinian side, because we need a strong Palestinian side to be able to then properly stand up for the Palestinians. That is only fair to view it that way, that if the Israelis are strong, then we need Palestinians to be just as strong in some ways to be able to then negotiate a just resolution to their issue and to end the occupation that they live under. Of course, there's a lot to discuss here. There are a lot of points of view on this, but it's important, of course, to have all of those discussed out in the open. I'll be back with the next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss Venezuela. We haven't discussed that for a few weeks on this show. There is a UN representative currently in Venezuela to assess the impact of the American sanctions on that country. They've been in place for a number of years now, but have been intensified, of course, especially certainly under the Trump administration since 2015. The U.S. government's accountability office, known by its abbreviation GAO, has acknowledged, in fact, in the recent past, that its country's sanctions on Venezuela have in fact killed many Venezuelans or have led to conditions that have killed many innocent Venezuelans. The UN representative herself, while she is in the country, I believe she's in the country till today, Friday that is, will be assessing the situation, i.e. the impact of the sanctions, as well, of course, as the government's own role in how to deal with the sanctions and to improve the lives of Venezuelans overall under such tough conditions. Both political and otherwise. Let's discuss that all a bit further. We're now joined with Dr. Puerta Riera, who is an adjunct professor at political science and sociology at Valencia College and Ana G. Mendez University. She's joining us this morning from Orlando, Florida. Joining us this morning from Caracas, the Venezuelan capital, is Jesus Rodriguez, who is the editor of Orinoco Tribune. Jesus and Maria, good morning to you both, and thank you both for joining us. Maria, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of the UN representative being in Venezuela, and what's your opinion overall about sanctions as they've been placed by the U.S. on Venezuela?
Good morning, Waqar. It's always great to be with you. I think it's important for them, for the UN, to have access to the country. And I think it's important to know that sanctions are not the only tool that can be used in this case in particular. But the problem has been that, first of all, we really don't know the extent to which the damage is as bad as it looks, I'm afraid it can be worse, but not because of the sanctions per se. I'm not saying they are not bad. I'm just saying that they are hurting those that are not intended to be the target, and that the regime, Maduro's regime, is using them as an excuse for their own failure. The effectiveness of sanctions depend as much as the entity that is issuing those sanctions. But it also depends on how other countries contribute to that reinforcement. And we know that Venezuela has had many countries helping them to avoid the impact of those sanctions. And that has mitigated some of the harm that is intended to those in the government to be, affected by those targeted sanctions. So I'm afraid that with the help of the UN mission, we're going to find much worse information about this.
Jesus, you're on the ground there. So tell us how bad is the situation? How much of that then economic situation being dire is the responsibility directly of the American sanctions?
Hi, thank you for inviting us. First of all, I have to tell you that the effects of the sanctions are real, and most of the ordinary Venezuelans are the ones that are paying for it. I mean, that are suffering it, especially with a lack of income that the state is not receiving. That affects everything, because Venezuela was sanctioned mainly on PDVSA, which is the state oil company, and that has put a humongous damage on the government, because the government right now lacks a lot of income. Actually, President Maduro said that we only received like 3% of what we were that we received in 2018 in terms of revenue. So you can imagine a state that received 100 2 years ago and right now is receiving like 3. So that's to give you an idea. So the situation is complicated. I have the impression that the government and the Venezuelan people has been facing it with a lot of courage and resilience, and I have the impression that besides being terrible, there's a positive side of the sanctions that are forcing us to try to do things better. And if going to your question directly, I would say that a lot of the problems that we are facing right now in Venezuela, most of them are the result of the sanctions. Of course, there's a problem with corruption and bad management. But if you ask me, of course, I'm a very Chavista guy. I will tell you that I believe that that's a small fraction of the negative effects that we have been seeing in Venezuela. And those effects are, as I told you, the services are terrible. We have a lot of scarcity of gasoline lately, and a lot of things that are not working properly because of the lack of resources.
Okay, so Maria, let's look for a moment, if we can, at the macro issue, right, of the U.S. role in Venezuela as a whole. We can talk about Guaido, we can talk about a lot of things, but do you think in some ways that there's actually that goal of the U.S., whatever we may term that goal to be, has failed?
I think it has. It has because on the one side, Trump's intention was for regime change, and sanctions are not very effective for regime change. We've seen it before. We've seen it in Cuba. We've seen it now in Nicaragua as well. So I think the strategy was bad from the beginning, because sanctions are a means to persuade someone to do something or to stop doing something. And that's not the case in terms of what Trump was aiming to do, which was for Maduro to step down or agree to an election. they will not agree on doing anything that will remove them from power. So that was absurd. The problem is that there was this sense or the image, the messaging of the sanctions was pretty much that it was going to produce some cracks that never happened. There were no fractures, and he's pretty much in charge with a solid, robust control of power. So I think the effectiveness was very limited. And I believe that this conversation has a lot to do with the fact that there were conditions previously in the economic infrastructure and the activities in general that, as your other guest has suggested, the country's dependence on oil revenue is so huge that you can see the consequences of it. There's no private businesses that can survive because they are so minor in comparison with the whole size of the economy depending on oil. And when you cut that from the government who is in charge of it, you have nothing. So the country is barely going by with the very little things like the use of dollar as the main currency, unofficial main currency. That tells you a lot about how the economy is working right now in terms of a structure that was previously overtaken.
So, Jesus, I'll give you the final word before I let both of you go. What happens next, do you think, looking into the next days, months, years, Jesus? Guaido, at least, it's quite clear, does not have the support of all Venezuelan peoples. He may have, some point in time, had some support, but that seems to have died down. How does one bring all Venezuelans together? Because that's the important thing, right? To have all citizens, or as many citizens, unite, right, within a country. How does that happen, do you think?
That's not an easy question, especially when you are in front of a polarized country like the case of Venezuela. I cannot offer you a definitive answer. I wish we could bypass all the polarization that politically talking have arisen in Venezuela in recent years, or maybe in the last 2 decades, especially since Hugo Chavez took power. But that's a reality. We are living with it. What you say, and I believe is absolutely right, is that the Guaido project has blown up in the face of Washington and a lot of right-wingers that were hoping that it will erase Maduro and Chavismo out of the face of the earth. And that takes me to the other analysis. It was not only like U.S. sanctions or European sanctions against Venezuela. I mean, we are talking about a holistic approach from the U.S. to get rid of Maduro's government. So we are talking about a very heavy diplomatic initiative. The Guaido project itself, like the crazy idea of having someone in the public street proclaiming himself as president of a country, which is a terrible precedent for the humanity. And the other side are the sanctions. So there's a bunch of and there are other levels of the regime change operation against Venezuela, but the good thing is that it haven't succeeded, and one might ask it oneself, what is the reason for that? If you only listen to the mainstream media, you will see that they will always say that Maduro is in power because of he controls the military and because of Cuba, Iran, and Russia and China and whatever. But they don't pay attention that there are like millions of Venezuelans that are Chavistas that are supporting him. So I believe that's very important to highlight because, I mean, you cannot erase something that is real. I mean, you cannot get rid of that easy, and that's why Maduro is still there. And I believe that anyone that takes that into consideration as a fact will make a good approach to finding a better political solution to political polarization that we have in Venezuela.
Very well. We'll leave there as a final comment, but we appreciate both of our guests for taking their time out this morning to share their expertise with us. We were talking there about Venezuela, specifically the American sanctions effect on the Latin American country. As both of our guests there spoke about, it's not just a question of sanctions that plays a role in why the economy is this bad in Venezuela at this time. Mismanagement, corruption, all of the above is probably also all a part of the mix which need to be addressed as well. But the sanctions certainly do not help, and they're not appreciated by the Venezuelan people themselves. Again, sanctions have been discussed in many contexts, right? Russia, Iran, and we can probably talk about other countries apart from Venezuela as well that have been under sanctions. Have those sanctions succeeded in overthrowing any of those respective governments? They have not, but they've in fact made life just harder for those nations' respective citizens. So you're not winning any hearts and minds. In fact, you're probably just creating further animosity towards your own respective ideals. I'll leave it there for now. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi, and in the final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss the United Kingdom's youngest terror offender, who is currently 16 years old, but in fact, a lot of his offenses start from when he was only 13 years old, and at which time he was already spreading and downloading things like bomb-making manuals. And in the ensuing years, he's also been involved in things like dissemination of terrorist documents, etc. also. This is disturbing, of course, on many levels, because this goes to the whole issue of online recruitment, online radicalization, of extremism of all forms, really, which has been of concern for many, many years. But it's certainly not a milestone to be proud of either, to have such a young child involved in such extremist ideology, anti-Semitism, amongst a whole bunch of other such hateful ideas as well. Let's discuss that a bit further. And I'm joined by Dr. Joshua Skoczylis, who is a senior lecturer of criminology and counterterrorism studies at the University of Lincoln. He's joining us today from Lincoln in the UK. Joshua, thank you for taking your time out to join us here in Scope today. As I said, not a milestone to be proud of, but how indicative of the problem of young people being radicalized online is this?
It's certainly not new. We have a lot of younger offenders, and extremism is attractive to younger people, specifically after 2008 and the financial crash then. The COVID crisis again makes it more appealing to younger people who have a lot of time and who have access to the internet and those sorts of ideologies. And obviously within those forums, there's people who prey on these younger people and try to recruit them to those extremist causes.
For many years, we've all seemingly, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, concentrated on basically one form of extremism, right? What we may term it Islamic terrorism, Islamist extremism, however we want to term that specific form of extremism. Do you think that in some ways that we've dropped the ball when it comes to far-right extremism, especially in how children react to that?
Certainly, and I think some experts have been talking about far-right extremism for quite some time, but it wasn't as appealing. There was no real terrorist attacks linked to far-right extremism, except for Anders Breivik's in Norway, for example. But it was there, it did exist, and it is something that some experts have been warning about for some time now. So obviously with the activities in America, with the Capitol Hill uprising, it's become more focus in the news now.
So how does then one deal with this? Because I know that in the UK, for example, we have the PREVENT program, right, which is meant to filter out and to find such forms of radicalization, extremism as well. I mean, that's at least what its stated goal is. And I know, of course, there's a whole host of criticism of the PREVENT program, especially, as I'm sure you well know, from the Muslim community. But do you think that that is the sort of program that is well suited to deal with the situation? Do we need something new? What are the solutions?
PREVENT has its good points. The particular case you raised, one of the reasons why he wasn't in prison was because of preventative activity, which has helped him move away from those extremist activities. So there is certainly a role for a PREVENT type program, But to tackle extremism of any form, there needs to be political will, political change that addresses the grievances that the people who engage in extremism and eventually terrorism have.
Right. So then when we're talking about things like, white jihad, genocide of non-white people, I mean, these are things which are rooted, again, correct me if I'm wrong, in some politicians' rhetoric too, right? And not necessarily politicians who are serving in higher office necessarily, but I mean, this is a growing idea of, where the white population, for example, in Europe and even in the United States and North America in general, there's some people who say that, that number or the majority is going to be lost and non-whites are going to take over. I mean, is that where this is coming from? And then what does one then tell and or police what politicians then say about such things?
That complicates the matter a lot. I mean, Donald Trump, for example, clearly tapped into that rhetoric of white supremacist, white nationalism, as have senior UK politicians like Boris Johnson, and even across Europe, are saying these parties are trying to tap into the vote of those people. That is very dangerous, and there's a danger of mainstreaming those sort of opinions and views. And that is again borne out by the data. Some racist views have become more and more acceptable, whereas 10 years or so, it was less acceptable to say some of the things that are openly said now.
Then, for example, Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party as a whole, we know that there has been a racism inquiry that has been requested, specifically Islamophobia inquiry, stuff like that. I mean, do you think that there is hope on the horizon, though, to deal with this sort of things? Because I would think at some levels that we are talking about at the root of this sort of far-right ideology, at least, or white supremacy, that there is a form of racism in that, right? So do you think that that's needs to be dealt with as well?
Yes, I do. I mean, racism certainly needs to be dealt with. Extremism on the entire spectrum, whether jihadi or far right, goes much deeper than that, though, because there's this sort of political disenfranchisement, this feeling of being left behind, not being in control of your future, and being a victim of the system. And those sorts of things also need addressing, and obviously including racism, but also gender inequality and issues like that.
There's also conversations that I've had in the past, Joshua, about how many politicians will resort to hate rhetoric, or others will resort to hate rhetoric of some sort, because it's a good deflection from the realities on the ground, right? So, for example, within the UK, we have the context of Brexit and the worries, the economic worries. Whether or not one is for or against leaving or staying in the EU is not what I'm trying to get to, but I'm just saying that there are concerns about, for example, economic impact within the country. Do you think that in some ways that these sorts of hate rhetoric, I'm talking in general, of course, become a perfect medium to deflect society's attention away from the real issues on the ground?
Certainly. It's always easy to pick somebody else as the perpetrator, whether it's Muslims in Europe or immigrants or whatever. It's always easy to blame them. Then we don't have to step back and think, actually, what is currently the problem? What have we done wrong? How do we need to change? And so, blaming the other is always an easy option and a vote winner for a lot of these parties.
Very well, Joshua, we'll leave that as our final comment, but we appreciate you taking your time out of your busy schedule to share your expertise with us. That was Joshua speaking to us there from Lincoln in the UK, sharing his thoughts with us about the youngest terror offender in the UK, a boy who was 13 at the time that he started downloading bomb-making manuals, as well as engaging in a whole host of far-right activities online as well, even recruiting others to join a specific group, which people or politicians within the UK have in fact called to be banned. And so, one wonders, obviously, that this milestone is not one to be proud of, but secondly, how does one then control this form of online radicalization, specifically when it comes to white supremacists, white nationalists, however we want to term that, because it seems, at least in my opinion, that that's been something that's been fairly overlooked, and that the world really, and many European countries / North American countries, need to quickly catch up before this becomes an even bigger threat than it already is. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.